It was Valentine's Day, the kind of day that used to mean something to us. Now, it was just another date on the calendar, marked by hollow gestures and forced smiles. But even in the routine of our marriage, I didn't see this coming. The call came just after midnight. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the heater battling the winter chill. The house felt too big, too empty, despite being filled with the artifacts of our life together. When my phone buzzed on the nightstand, I grabbed it without thinking, expecting a wrong number or maybe one of those late-night spam calls. But it was Lisa. Her voice was tight, hurried. "Hey, babe. I'm stuck at work. The project ran late, and I've got to stay a bit longer. Don't wait up, okay?" There was something in her tone, something off. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, like she was reading from a script she didn't quite believe herself. I knew Lisa's voice better than my own heartbeat. I could tell when she was tired, when she was stressed, when she was lying. Tonight, it was all three. I forced a smile into my voice, keeping things light. On Valentine's Day? Come on, Lisa. That's brutal. She laughed, but it was hollow, a sound that didn't reach her eyes. I could hear it. Yeah, well, deadlines don't care about chocolates and roses. We said our goodnights, but as I hung up, the weight in my chest didn't ease. I stared at the dark ceiling for a long time, my mind replaying every second of that call. Something wasn't right. Then, without fully knowing why, I got up. I didn't plan it. I didn't even think about it. I just moved, like my body knew something my mind wasn't ready to admit. I grabbed my keys, the bouquet of flowers I'd bought earlier, and drove toward her office downtown. The streets were quiet, the city wrapped in a sleepy kind of silence that only comes in the dead of night. As I turned onto her street, I saw it, her car. But it wasn't parked outside her office. It was sitting across from a hotel, a cheap one, the kind with flickering neon lights and curtains drawn tight against the world. My heart didn't sink. It didn't shatter. It just stopped, like it had been waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, it had no reason to keep going. I pulled over a few blocks away, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The flowers lay on the passenger seat, a cruel joke now. I stared at that hotel sign, its blinking light reflecting in my windshield like it was mocking me. For a long time, I sat there, not sure what to do next. Part of me wanted to turn around, go home, and pretend this was just a bad dream. But another part, the part that still believed in us, in her, needed to know the truth. So I got out of the car and started walking. The night air was sharp against my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was a blur of memories and questions, every step bringing me closer to a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. And as I approached that hotel, my heart started beating again. Not with hope, but with something colder, sharper. Because deep down, I already knew. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't have predicted, was that Lisa's betrayal wasn't just about another man. No, it was much worse. And I had a secret of my own, one that would change everything. The lobby smelled like stale air freshener and disappointment. Cheap beige wallpaper peeled at the corners, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering just enough to make the place feel more like a holding cell than a hotel. I stood in the doorway for a moment, the flowers still clutched in my hand like some kind of sick prop in a play I hadn't agreed to perform in. The receptionist barely glanced up from her phone as I walked past, her apathy a strange comfort. I wasn't sure what I'd say if she asked why I was there. "I'm here to surprise my wife," I could have said, but she's already beaten me to it. I moved down the hallway, each step echoing louder in my ears than the last. I didn't know the room number, but I didn't need to. I followed the faint sound of laughter, her laughter, floating from behind one of the doors like smoke from a fire I was about to walk straight into. Room 214. I stood outside that door for longer than I care to admit, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to warn me one last time. Turn around. Go home. Pretend you never saw her car, never heard her voice twist into lies. But I was past pretending. I needed to see it, needed to feel it. I raised my hand and knocked. Silence. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it all. Maybe I was standing outside a stranger's room, and Lisa was really at her desk, cursing deadlines and sipping stale office coffee. But then I heard it, the shuffle of feet, the hushed whisper of voices trying to decide whether or not to answer. And then the door cracked open. She stood there in nothing but a hotel bathrobe, her hair damp from a shower she hadn't taken for me. Her face drained of color the moment she saw me, like all the blood in her body had decided it didn't want to stick around for this conversation. "Jake!" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it hit me like a gunshot. "What are you doing here?" I stared at her for a long moment, trying to remember how to breathe. "Happy Valentine's Day, Lisa." I held out the flowers, my hands steady even though everything inside me was unraveling. "I thought I'd surprise you." Her eyes flicked to the bouquet, then back to me. She didn't take them. She didn't even pretend to. Instead, she stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click like that could somehow shut away the truth. But I'd already heard the other man's voice inside, low and panicked, asking who was at the door. She didn't offer an excuse, didn't spin a lie. She just looked at me, and in that look, I saw everything. The guilt, the regret, the bitter acceptance of the moment we both knew had been coming for a long time. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she whispered. "Yeah." My voice was calm, too calm. "How did you mean for me to find out, Lisa?" She closed her eyes, exhaling like she was carrying the weight of my heartbreak instead of her own betrayal. "I was going to tell you. I've been meaning to." "For how long?" I cut her off, the words sharp enough to make her flinch. "How long have you been meaning to, Lisa?" "Because I've been meaning to spend the rest of my life with you." "Guess we both had plans." She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence between us said more than any confession could. It stretched out, heavy and suffocating, until finally, she whispered the words I already knew were coming. "I've been seeing him for a few months," she admitted, her voice barely audible over the pounding in my ears. "But it's not just a fling, Jake. I'm leaving you." There it was, the final nail in the coffin. But it wasn't the affair that hit me hardest. No, it was who she was leaving me for. Because as the door behind her creaked open, and he stepped out, his face half hidden in the shadows, I felt the ground shift beneath me. It wasn't just some stranger. It was Mark. Mark, my best friend. The man who'd toasted our wedding, who'd helped me move into our first apartment, who'd sat at my kitchen table drinking my beer, laughing with my wife while I played the fool. And in that moment, standing in that dim hallway with a bouquet of dead flowers in my hand, I realized something else, something that made the betrayal burn hotter, sharper. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was the fool in this story. But what they didn't know, what Lisa didn't know, was that I'd been keeping a secret of my own. And now, it was my turn to play the game. Mark's face was a mask of guilt and something worse, pity. That smug, practiced expression he wore when he thought he was the smartest guy in the room. Except this time, the room was the hallway of a cheap hotel, and I wasn't the idiot he'd pegged me for. "Jake," he started, like he was about to offer some bullshit apology, but I raised my hand before he could get the words out. "Don't," I said. My voice was low, steady, too steady. "Just don't." Lisa stood there between us, the robe slipping off one shoulder, exposing skin I'd once traced like a map. Now, it felt foreign, like I was looking at a stranger wearing my wife's face. For a moment, none of us spoke. The silence stretched so thin it could have snapped under the weight of everything unsaid. I could hear the hum of the vending machine down the hall, the faint squeak of the ice machine kicking on. Funny how, in moments like these, the world keeps turning like nothing's happened. Like your life isn't shattering in slow motion. I took a step back, the flowers still clutched in my hand. They looked ridiculous now. Roses wrapped in cheap plastic, petals starting to wilt under the fluorescent lights. I let them fall to the floor without ceremony, the soft thud of betrayal landing between us. "I don't even know what to say," Mark muttered, rubbing the back of his neck like he was the one who'd been blindsided. I chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that echoed down the hallway. "That's a first. You always had something to say, didn't you, Mark? Always knew how to spin a story, how to charm your way out of anything." I looked at Lisa then, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Guess you found someone who could lie as well as you. She flinched like I'd slapped her, but I didn't care. The time for soft words and second chances was long gone. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you? I asked, my gaze flicking between them. This wasn't some random mistake. This was deliberate. Lisa's mouth opened, but no words came out. She didn't have to answer. The truth was written all over her face. And that's when it hit me. Not the betrayal itself, but the realization that they thought they'd won. They thought they'd blindsided me, pulled the rug out from under my feet. But they didn't know the whole story. I stepped closer, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You've been planning to leave me, Lisa. But here's the thing. You should have done it sooner. She blinked, confused, the shift in my tone catching her off guard. What are you talking about? I smiled then, a slow, deliberate thing that felt foreign on my face. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? You and Mark, running off together, leaving me to pick up the pieces. But there's one little problem. Mark crossed his arms, his bravado flickering back to life. And what's that? I leaned in, close enough to see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension in his jaw. I've got something you don't know about. Something you can't touch. Lisa's brow furrowed. What are you talking about, Jake? I straightened, savoring the moment. The money, Lisa. The money you don't know about. Their faces shifted in unison, Mark's eyes narrowing, Lisa's lips parting in a silent gasp. You see, I continued, pacing slowly down the hall like I had all the time in the world. About a year ago, I came into a little windfall. Nothing crazy at first, just an investment that started to pay off. But then, it grew. Quietly. Steadily. While you were busy sneaking around with him, I was busy securing a future you'll never be a part of. Lisa's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like she was struggling for air. Jake, why didn't you tell me? I stopped and looked at her, the weight of a decade of shared memories pressing down on my chest. Why didn't you tell me about him? I shot back, gesturing toward Mark, who now looked less like a confident homewrecker and more like a man realizing he'd just stepped into quicksand. You think you can just walk away with everything? Mark sneered, trying to regain control. You're not the only one who can play smart. I laughed then, a deep, bitter sound that echoed off the cheap wallpaper. You really think this is about winning, Mark? You two deserve each other. But I'm not the one who's going to be left with nothing. I turned to Lisa, my gaze sharp. You've been planning to leave me for months, but I've been planning too. The difference is, I'm better at it. She looked like she wanted to argue, to claw back some sense of control, but the words never came. Because she knew. She knew. I took one last look at them, my wife and my best friend, standing in the wreckage of what used to be my life, and I felt something unexpected. Relief. I'll have my lawyer call you, I said, turning on my heel. Oh, and Lisa? She blinked, tears spilling down her cheeks now. Happy Valentine's Day. And with that, I walked away, leaving them in that dim, suffocating hallway, the sound of their betrayal fading behind me. The cold air outside hit me like a slap, but it felt cleaner than the suffocating hotel hallway. I got in my car, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. My heart should have been racing, but instead, there was this eerie calm settling over me, like my body had already processed the betrayal before my mind caught up. I didn't go home. I couldn't, not yet. Instead, I drove aimlessly through the city streets, the flowers still lying crumpled on the passenger's seat like a bad joke. I kept replaying their faces in my head. Mark's smug, unraveling bravado and Lisa's stunned silence when I dropped the bomb about the money. That look of fear? That was worth every ounce of heartbreak. But the truth? I wasn't as untouched as I pretended. You don't spend years building a life with someone, only to walk away without feeling the cracks beneath your feet. The memories weren't just disappearing because I'd caught them in the act. The laughter, the late-night talks, the plans for the future. They were still there, lingering like smoke after a fire. But now, they were tainted. I pulled into an empty parking lot overlooking the city skyline. This was where I needed to be, alone, staring out at a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. I thought about Lisa. about the years we'd shared, the trust I'd given so freely. And then I thought about that hotel, about the way she didn't even try to deny it. That hurt more than anything, the ease with which she let it all fall apart. But I wasn't going to be the one left picking up the pieces. I had leverage, and they didn't even see it coming. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the blinds felt intrusive, like it had no business lighting up the ruins of my life. I didn't sleep much, but when I did, it was fitful, haunted by flashes of Lisa's face, Mark's smug grin, and the hotel room door slamming shut behind me. When my phone buzzed, I didn't need to look to know it was Lisa. I let it ring. She called again and again. Voicemails piled up, her voice growing increasingly frantic. But I wasn't ready to hear her excuses, or worse, her apologies. Instead, I called someone else. My lawyer, Tom, was an old college buddy. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy from sleep. But when I told him what happened, and more importantly about the money, his tone shifted instantly. "Jake," he said, "you've got the upper hand. Let's keep it that way." That was the plan. By noon, Lisa had shown up at the house. I heard her before I saw her, the sound of her car door slamming, her hurried footsteps on the porch. I didn't move. I watched from the window as she pounded on the door, shouting my name, her voice cracking with desperation. But I stayed still. I wanted her to feel the silence, to sit in the emptiness she'd created. Eventually, she gave up, sinking onto the porch steps, her head in her hands. She sat there for nearly an hour before finally driving away. And as I watched her car disappear down the street, I realized something. She wasn't the one leaving me. I was the one letting her go. 2 days passed before I saw her again. Lisa texted, called, even emailed like it was the early 2000s. Each message bled the same frantic tone. Apologies, explanations, promises to talk things through. But there was nothing left to explain. She'd already said everything the moment she opened that hotel door. But then, Mark showed up. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was halfway through boxing up some of Lisa's stuff when I heard the knock. It wasn't timid like Lisa's had been. It was sharp, annoyed. I opened the door to find Mark standing there like he had every right to be on my porch. Like this wasn't the scene of his betrayal. He looked the same, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Jake," he started, his voice flat, "we need to talk." I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. "Oh, now you want to talk?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't plan for this to happen, okay? It just did. Things with Lisa and me, they. Spare me the details." I cut in. "I don't need the romance novel version." Mark bristled, but he kept going. "I just think we can handle this like adults. No need to get lawyers involved. We can work this out." I couldn't help it, I laughed. A deep, bitter laugh that wiped whatever confidence he'd walked up here with right off his face. "Work this out," I repeated, stepping closer. "Mark, you slept with my wife. You're standing on my porch, in the house I paid for, telling me how to handle this." He flinched like the words stung more than he expected. But I wasn't done. "You think this is about hurt feelings? You think I'm just gonna roll over and let you both walk away clean? Nah, buddy." I smiled then, a sharp, cold thing. "You picked the wrong guy to screw over." He shifted, his bravado slipping. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, stepping back and starting to close the door, "you should tell Lisa to check her bank account." And with that, I shut the door in his face. That night, I transferred every penny from our joint account into one-eyed open months ago. A precaution at first, back when I noticed Lisa growing distant, when the cracks in our marriage started to show. But now, it was more than a precaution. It was power. She called less after that. When she did, it wasn't the panicked, tearful Lisa from the hotel hallway. It was a different Lisa, the cold, calculating one I hadn't seen in years. The one who used to negotiate better deals for our mortgage, who knew how to push people's buttons to get what she wanted. But I wasn't the same Jake anymore. "Jake," her voicemail played out one evening, her voice cool, controlled. "We need to figure out the finances. You can't just drain our accounts. That's illegal." I saved the message, smiling to myself. Lisa was always good at playing the victim when it suited her. But this wasn't about legality. It was about consequences. The next day, I sent her an email. Lisa, you'll be hearing from Tom. He's handling the divorce paperwork. As for the money, you can have what's left after the legal process. Don't bother calling. There's nothing left to say. Jake. Simple. Direct. No room for negotiation. I half expected her to show up again, to scream on the porch or send Mark to do her dirty work. But she didn't. She knew the game was over. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. For the first time in years, the house felt quiet. Not the tense, suffocating kind of silence that crept in when Lisa and I had our fights. No, this was different. It was the kind of quiet that settled in your bones when you finally stopped carrying a weight you didn't realize was crushing you. I packed up her things methodically. Her clothes, her jewelry, all the little knickknacks she'd sprinkled throughout the house to make it ours. Funny how those things just looked like clutter now. The bed felt bigger. The rooms echoed when I walked through them. But instead of feeling empty, it felt like space I could finally breathe in. And yet, there were moments when the stillness made it hard to ignore the ghosts. The sound of her laughter from the kitchen, the memory of her curled up next to me on the couch, the way her perfume used to linger in the air long after she'd left the room. But ghosts don't have power unless you give it to them. And I was done giving Lisa anything. Just when I thought I'd regained control, life reminded me that even the best-laid plans have their cracks. It was a Wednesday afternoon when Tom called. I expected it to be a routine update about the divorce, but his tone was different, tight, cautious. Jake, he said, there's something you need to know. I sat down, my stomach knotting in ways I hadn't felt since that night at the hotel. What is it? She's contesting the divorce, Tom said, pausing for effect. And she's got a lawyer who's digging into your finances. I let out a breath, the tension I thought I'd buried bubbling right back to the surface. Let them dig. They'll find nothing illegal. That's not the problem, Tom said. It's who she's working with. I frowned. What do you mean? There was a beat of silence before Tom answered. Mark's not just her lover, Jake. He's her business partner. They've been planning to open a boutique together using some of your money. For a second, I couldn't speak. The betrayal had already burned through me. But this was gasoline on the embers. They're trying to use my money to build a life together, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Tom's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. And they're banking on you being too broken to fight back. I smiled then, a cold, sharp smile that felt more like me than it ever had. Let them try, I said quietly. They have no idea who they're messing with. If Lisa and Mark thought they could play me, they clearly forgot who I was. I met with Tom the next day, laying out everything I hadn't told Lisa. The offshore accounts, the private investments, the windfall that had quietly grown while they were busy sneaking around in hotel rooms. They think they're clever, Tom said, scanning the paperwork. But you've got them right where you want them. I nodded. Let's make sure they know that. Within days, the legal counters were in place. Lisa's lawyer got hit with evidence of her affair, financial misconduct, and proof that Mark had been using company resources for personal gain. Every stone they thought I wouldn't turn over, I flipped it. But it wasn't just about the legal battle. It was about making sure they felt the same helplessness I'd felt that night in the hotel. And oh, they did. It didn't take long for things to unravel for them. Mark lost his job after the financial misconduct surfaced. Turns out, using company funds to wine and dine your best friend's wife isn't a great look on a resume. Their boutique never saw the light of day. Investors pulled out when they realized the mess they were stepping into. Lisa tried to hold on, but without Mark's charm and her grip on my money, she was left with nothing but her pride. And that didn't pay the bills. I didn't hear from her again after the divorce papers were signed. She took the small settlement the court allowed her and disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a few memories I'd long since buried. And Mark? Last I heard, he was bartending at some dive across town, trying to piece together a life from the wreckage he helped create. Funny how things turn out. Months passed. The house felt lighter. I felt lighter. I took a trip. Just me, the open road, and no destination. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to anyone else's expectations. The world felt wide open in a way it hadn't since before Lisa. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I found myself sitting on a quiet beach, the waves lapping at the shore, the sky burning with colors I didn't have the words to describe. And for the first time in a long time, I realized something. It wasn't just about surviving betrayal. It was about reclaiming me. The man I was before Lisa, before the lies, before the heartache. And as I sat there, breathing in the salt air, I knew one thing for sure. They'd taken their shot, but I was still standing. If you like the story, please like and subscribe to the channel.